lot of things to talk about today. Go over some stuff for the class. Obviously, continue with our discussion from last week. I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the world as well. Obviously, this crisis over Russia and the Ukraine. So there's a lot of stuff to go over. I'll try to go through it as quick as I can, but just some basic stuff, pertaining to this class first. So let me move this over here so you can see better. So I put up the next assignment on the culture industry. So this is really the first time for this class that we're going over, we're spending a second week basically on the same text. So even though there was an assignment last week on Horkheimer and Adorno, which is still open, I see only 6 people have completed, which is half the class, but a few people have not. That's still open, but there will also be then a second assignment for this week, basically on the second part of the book, right, which deals with the concept of the culture industry. That refers to the chapter from the book, The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, as well as the Adorno essay from later on, The Culture Industry Reconsidered, which was written actually in the 1960s. It's the only writing from this period, from this part of the class, which basically is from after World War II. Everything else that we've looked at is either before or written during World War II. That essay by Adorno comes afterwards, but obviously, as the title of it suggests, it is a reconsideration basically of the stuff that Adorno is talking about from this first essay written in the 1940s. Basically, though, everything after in the second part of the class though will be written after World War II. So that's up there. So if you haven't had a chance, you have until the end of the week, obviously, but you haven't yet complete the second assignment there. So I think that's pretty much it. I do want to resume some things that we were talking about last class. We started talking about Dialectic of Enlightenment in Thursday's class because we spent an extra class talking about Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history, a work which I said very much was influenced Dialectic of Enlightenment. In fact, if you read the text carefully, you'll see references here and there towards the aura and things like that, towards concepts that Benjamin invented himself, basically. But I think I want to finish up talking about the first essay, what is enlightenment. We're mostly going to skip over the second chapter on Odysseus, with some mention of it, which actually comes from the first essay. So some of the most celebrated passages from Dialectic of Enlightenment are this metaphor that they have talking about Odysseus and the sirens and the song of the sirens, which we'll cover a little bit. But that's actually from the first essay. The second essay sort of elaborates on that a little bit. We're going to, for the most part, skip over that, and then basically just go into talking about the culture industry, which I think is one of the most important concepts, and probably what the main sort of legacy of critical theory is, and the Frankfurt School. But as I already said, being this is a political science class, obviously this gives a platform to talk about contemporary political issues, and I think it's important to at least spend some time talking about what's going on now with Russia and the Ukraine. I do think it relates well to some of the themes that we're talking about in our class, and hopefully I'll have a sort of a smooth segue into that. But let me just get started with, because I'm sure you've heard a lot of talk about it. It's pretty much all people were talking about over the weekend. Like many things that come out of American media, though, I feel like oftentimes they're lacking in content, and you get a very sort of superficial analysis of things, a very one-sided view of things. So I'd like to try to inject a little more complexity into the debate here. I thought I'd start with this quote from the historian Arno Mayer, who's not writing about Russia and Ukraine at all, but actually really talking about the First World War. But I think what he has to say very much relates to both Russia and the United States. Particularly, on this emphasis on internal contradictions, which go on, within capitalist states. So let me just read this excerpt of a quote from him right here. So it says, This is from an article by the World Socialist website, by the way. Meyer noted half a century ago in a study of the dynamics of counter-revolution that strained and unstable internal conditions tend to make elites markedly intransigent, meaning basically, rigid or inflexible, and disposed to exceptionally drastic, not to say extravagantly hazardous, preemptive solutions. Beleaguered and vulnerable governments and political classes are more likely to be disposed for than against recourse to mounting external conflict or war. By both reflex and calculation, they assume that the members of a seriously torn polity and society will pull together once they are confronted with a common and imminent external threat and foe. Such governments inclined to use heightened external conflict or war as an instrument of internal social cohesion as an antidote to insurrection, revolution, civil war, or secession that they claim to be imminent. The ultimate objective is to monetize a striking diplomatic or military victory to restore, preferably to enhance the waning power and prestige of internally enfeebled regimes, governments, and elites. Now, again, I think it's a particularly relevant passage because it really relates well both to Russia and to the United States. So what he's basically saying here, Mayer, who is a Marxist historian, is that countries that are sort of deteriorating inwardly or prone to serious social conflict will seek out war basically as a way to distract the population, as a way to foster a kind of sense of social cohesion among antagonistic classes, and basically serves also as a pretext basically to suppress dissent at home. And I think if you look at the motives of both Russia and the United States, I think that is the case. I mean what Russia, what Putin is doing is obviously horrible and obviously quite stupid on his part. But I think to some extent he was provoked. I think to some extent he was baited by the United States, and he kind of took the bait. And the reasons for that, I think, is that if you look at Russia, it is very much a society in crisis. It is a society that is basically falling apart from within. The standard of living of most people in Russia is probably worse now than it was under the Soviet era. Putin himself, represents a class of people, a class of economic elites, former Soviet officials who, when the transition was made from the Soviet system to the current more market-based capitalist system now, kind of use their insider knowledge to basically gobble up all the to buy up basically all the valuable assets and all the valuable resources within Russia, which of course has created a very narrow group of elites, or a narrow class of elites that basically own most of the wealth in Russia. And there are numerous indicators of high levels of drug abuse among Russian people, suicide, things like that. All sorts of indicators that you can point to a declining standard of living, to again a society that's basically collapsing from within. And of course, this is also very much accelerated by the pandemic, which Russia has also dealt with in a very horrible way. But it also relates to the United States, right? And everything I just pointed out about Russia could almost equally be applied to the United States as well. It is also a society in crisis. It is also a society is basically deteriorating from within, and there's all sorts of horrible economic and social indicators that point to that. It is also a country that's dealt horribly with the COVID pandemic as well. In fact, by most accounts, the worst in the world in terms of cases and deaths and things like that. So I think both countries here, both the capitalist ruling classes in both countries, and Russia is a capitalist country, right? The Soviet Union has not existed for a long time now, so you can't blame this on communism, or what they call communism. But these are both, like I said, basically capitalist countries that are both sort of falling apart from within. And I think war serves as a very seductive way of taking people's attention and focus away from things like the pandemic, from things like the larger sort of decline of social livelihoods within both of these countries. And again, when my Mayer is writing this in reference to World War I, so this has nothing at all to do with the current day conflict. His area of expertise as a historian basically is what he calls the 30-year crisis from 1914 to 1945, which in itself I think is kind of an interesting way of looking at that period of time, as instead of just two world wars as one sort of prolonged crisis. But as he argues, I would say fairly persuasively, if you looked at the situation and all of the major players in World War I, where they were in 1914, all of the countries were involved in serious, there's a serious sort of social and political crisis going on in all these countries. You had radical movements that were sort of on the rise. So his argument basically for the First World War is that war was fought, again, a reaction to the contradictions within capitalism that create insurmountable social conflicts that governments are unable to resolve. And so war becomes a tempting way of sort of diverting people's attention from social conflicts at home, to unify people against a common threat, an external threat, and also serves as a pretext, again, like I said, for clamping down on political dissent. I mean, you certainly saw it in the case of the United States as well, which gets into the war, relatively late. Laws like the Espionage Act, which are still in effect today, are passed during this period of time. Hundreds, if not thousands, of socialists and anarchists were arrested. Hundreds of people were deported during this period of time. So war has always been used as a way to sort of crack down on dissent, to sort of get the people all on one side, and those who don't go along with it basically face serious consequences for doing so. So I think that's certainly one aspect of it. And I'd like to in a moment point, there was an article actually by Rutgers. I don't know if people, does everyone get these emails? I get these emails constantly, like Rutgers Today or something like that. And it had one article on under the headline, why did Putin invade Ukraine, which is very, enticing, right? If you want to read it and actually get some insight into it. Unfortunately, and I have the article up here, I think it falls very well short of that. But another important aspect I think to keep in mind, if I can move this thing as it's obstructing my view, is the issue of NATO and the importance of this. As I said, I think you can really argue that the U.S. I think did a lot to provoke this conflict as well, and a lot of this conflict has to do with NATO, has to do with Ukraine's potential membership or aspiring to membership in this organization. So what is NATO basically? I mean, it is a military alliance. It was created in 1949 for the express purposes of containing the Soviet Union. It has no other purpose than that. It's not some kind of cultural exchange program or anything like that. It is an explicit military alliance of countries basically aligned against the Soviet Union, with, of course, the U.S. providing the main support and backing for it. And it was, used again, an attack on any NATO country, would be basically an equivalent to an attack on the United States itself. And I wonder, even in that regard, if people were to put something like that to a vote, how many people would actually support that idea? That they would be willing to go to war with a country, that attacked a NATO country as if it was an attack upon the United States itself. So it's very much a relic of the Cold War. It probably, in all reasonableness, should have been taken apart after the Cold War ended. When the Cold War was winding down in 1989, the U.S. government, under the Bush administration at that time, Gorbachev promised the Russian government that they would not expand NATO eastward beyond its current, membership. And long story short, the U.S. lied. We broke that promise. NATO, as this graph shows you here, this is from Wikipedia. Actually, you don't really have to search hard to find these things, but it shows you basically a sort of timeline, or as it says, the subheading here: NATO's added 14 new members since German reunification and the end of the Cold War. So East Germany is pictured there in dark green, joins in 1990. All the other countries that have joined, and of course you can see clearly this sort of eastward push of NATO, basically all occurred after the end of the Cold War. Ukraine isn't even highlighted here, but it would be, if you can see my cursor here, it would be basically here. So we lied, I mean, we basically promised the Russian government that we would not expand NATO, and clearly we did not, live up to our end of the bargain. And I think, it is a reasonable fear that the Russian government has, that if Ukraine were to become a part of NATO, that it could be used basically as a kind of, staging ground, or basically a base of operations for future military incursions against Russia, which does, of course, have very valuable natural resources, oil, natural gas. Funny how most of these conflicts, that we get into usually involve a country that has, vast reserves of oil or other energy resources that we may need. So when I say that, the U.S. provoked Putin and baited Putin, and again, Putin kind of stupidly, I would say, sort of took the bait here. I do think that was a big factor here. That the Ukraine should not really be part of NATO. Frankly, none of these countries, since the end of the Cold War, should be part of NATO. And NATO arguably shouldn't even exist itself. It should have been an organization that was, wound down or dissolved basically at the end of the Cold War. So I just wanted to point some of these things out, which I think are important factors. I don't think you're going to hear much of that in the mainstream media. I haven't heard any of it so far in the mainstream media, or even other, analyses made by, so-called serious academics or historians. And, as somebody who, I was a college student basically when, Iraq happened, and the weapons of mass destruction and all that stuff. So I remember what it's like when the propaganda machine really kicks into high gear. And so I do think it is important to point some of these things out, because the propaganda is going to be very intense. It already has been, obviously, like I said, this is all basically people I knew were talking about over the weekend. And I've already seen, some examples of this kind of, propaganda at work. So I just thought I'd like to point out. So let me look. So everything I just said, for example, so this is the Rutgers article I was talking about, or was, published under this, website, Rutgers Today or something like that. And this is from, Friday. So this is pretty recent. And again, it doesn't say it here, but in my email, it had it under the heading, why did Putin invade Ukraine? And this is from a Professor Alexander Model, who teaches at Newark, actually, in the Department of Political Science. Has written a bunch of books on the Ukraine, apparently, so is somewhat of an expert. And unfortunately, none of the things I just said make it into this analysis at all. So this is the Q&A session. I don't know who this other guy is, Lawrence Lerner, but he's the one in the the bold black type asking the questions. Let's start with some big picture questions before addressing the Ukraine invasion. What primary historical factors led us to this point, and what responsibility, if any, does the U.S. and Europe, does the U.S., Europe, and NATO bear? So he responds, the key deep historical factors relates to Russian political culture, which has traditionally been authoritarian and hostile to a Ukrainian identity. Putin embodies both qualities. The second factor is Putin's transformation of Russia from an imperfectly democratic state in the 1990s to a fascist state today. Fascist rulers generally promise greatness to their nations, and Putin, like Mussolini, is no exception. Finally, the more immediate historical factor is NATO enlargement. So we're talking about NATO here. But listen to what he says about it. It extended protection to countries that were under no threat. Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, extended protection to countries that were indefensible. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. It annoyed the Russians, and most importantly, left Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova in a security no man's land, trapped between an indifferent Europe and a neo-imperialist Russia. So none of the things I just mentioned before, the internal crisis of capitalism within Russia and the United States, makes it into this analysis at all. To the extent that they mention NATO, it's significantly downplayed, that it's an annoyance to the Russians. No acknowledgement that it represents a broken promise that we basically made to the Russian government at the end of the Cold War. And I would say it's more than an annoyance. Again, I think they have a credible fear in thinking that the Ukraine, as well as other countries, could be used as, again, sort of like a staging ground for future military invasions or military, interventions against Russia. And that, and then that really has to go back to the sort of critical view that people have of American power, or the lack of a critical view. Some people are so just sort of, stuck in this way of thinking that the United States are the good guys no matter what. And I've already, had this kind of, pushback from talking to people about it. They oh, that's no, we would never do that. We would never invade Russia. We don't go around invading countries for no reason. It's like, well, yeah, we kind of do actually. We have done that numerous times in the past. In fact, pretty much every country that we've been at war with since the end of World War II has basically been countries that we attacked first and really pose no, significant, threat to the United States at all. So I don't think it is an irrational fear to think that, that something like that could actually happen. But here it's downplayed as simply an annoyance. And again, like I said, no acknowledgement that, it basically breaks a promise that we made with the Russian government at the end of the Cold War. And so basically the analysis here, which I would say is not particularly deep, is that, Putin is basically just a bad guy who does bad things. That's essentially the analysis that most people have given over this situation. I'm not aware of any real, significant exceptions to that, at least coming out of sort of the mainstream sectors here. And really from this, political scientist who basically teaches here at Rutgers. And many people are very critical of the media, particularly younger people, and I would say for good reason. I would, unfortunately say that I think a lot of the critiques that people have of the media in this country would also really extend to most academics as well, particularly people in, fields like political science and things like that. But they are in many ways not much better than, basically a mouthpiece for, US propaganda. I mean, that's why it's funny when these conservatives act like college professors are these far left radicals and things like that. I mean, it's a joke. It's almost the opposite. I mean, most of them are basically, like I said, a little better than propagandists for American empire. At least the ones that rise up to, tenured positions and get, asked to, give interviews and things like that. Certainly the more, prominent members in the field. So, and I mean, you can go on from there. I mean, this is a fairly short piece. Putin has been playing a long game to destabilize Western democracies and NATO using asymmetric warfare and operating on many fronts. What are his ultimate goals? I mean, what does that even mean, other than maybe a sort of veiled reference to Russiagate, to the sort of unproven allegations that, Russia, hacked our elections and got Donald Trump elected president, something which of course has never been proven, actually, of course. Anyway, the response is his most immediate long-term goal is to transform Ukraine into a vassal of Russia. That would immediately undermine Ukrainian democracy, civil society, and Western orientation. Demonstrate to the other post-Soviet states that democracy has no future, that subservience to Russia is their only option, and at the same time show that the West, especially the EU and NATO, is unwilling to match its high-sounding words regarding democracy and human rights with the appropriate deeds. Putin's ultimate goal is to establish a greater Russian empire that would incorporate all the territories held by Soviet and Imperial Russia. Ukraine is the jewel in that crown. So many references to democracy here. And I think this is really where I think can sort of serve as a segue to getting back to talking about the Frankfurt School. I mean, you can read the rest of this. They talk about sanctions. Should we impose, tougher sanctions? Since the U.S. was certain that war was imminent and proved to be right, it made little sense to impose sanctions after the imminent war breaks out. Well, again, saying it's imminent is again underplaying the fact that the U.S. essentially provoked this war. If I do something to provoke you, if I call your mother a big fat pig or something like that, and then you punch me in the face, and then I turn around and say, look, this person's a violent person. I knew he was going to strike me. It's like any reasonable person would say, well, you provoked it. You created the conditions that led to this happening. So saying that the U.S. was certain that the war was imminent, yeah, I mean, it did everything that it could to provoke the war. Again, through this, sponsorship of NATO, of the Ukraine going into NATO. And you can tell that this is, the claims like this are going to be used to say well, look, you can't doubt what the U.S. says about, the aggressive, impulses of certain countries that, if we think war is imminent, we got to do something before the war happens. I mean, you can, I think, easily see how that kind of rationale will be used to, justify, future military incursions as well. So, I'm not going to say much more about this. Again, I don't know if everyone gets these emails. I do. I get them like almost like every week or twice a week or something like that. But it's this idea of democracy that I want to talk a little bit about as well. And again, I think this will sort of serve as the segue to getting back into the topic of this class. Democracy, the way the political scientists define it here in the United States, is purely a formalistic concept. It is an example basically of form without any content. And I'll basically, I'll try to explain a little bit more of what I mean by that. But to argue that the Ukraine or even the United States is democratic in any meaningful way, I think is very suspect. The Ukraine, first of all, the Ukrainian government, I mean, the U.S. sponsored a coup in Ukraine, basically overturned a government in 2014, which the current government sort of derives from. They have had elections since then, but I mean, we less than a decade ago basically overturned, the government that already existed there. I don't know that much about the Ukraine, to be honest with you, but the stuff I've been reading recently, says that the Ukrainian government is, filled with neo-Nazis and people like that. In fact, in a lot of these, former Russian or former Soviet states, they see people like that. That the Ukrainian, that the ruling class in the Ukraine is very much like the Russian ruling class, or again, the ruling class in a lot of these post-Soviet states, and that they are basically, former political insiders who, again, capitalize on their insider knowledge to basically, absorb all the valuable resources in these countries once they made the transition from the Soviet system to the current system. And again, basically represent a very narrow segment of the population that, basically controls most of the wealth in these countries. And let me go back a little bit. So he refers to Russia's transformation from an imperfectly democratic state in the 1990s to a fascist state today. Do people know that Russia in 1993, the Boris Yeltsin basically closed down the parliament when they tried to impeach him? That he had, in fact, ordered the military to storm into the Russian parliament, shut it down, and then basically for the next 6 years, from 93 to 99, basically ruled by presidential decree without any kind of parliamentary or congressional oversight. That's, and you call that an imperfect democratic state? These terms like democracy and fascism are used purely as a matter of convenience, right? When it's convenient to us, when it's convenient to the United States government, you're willing to overlook, obvious human rights abuses and obvious, authoritarian tendencies. And when you don't like the government, basically you label them as being fascist. And I have no problem with calling Putin a fascist today, but what do you call a person who, again, basically orders the military to close down the parliament and then rules by presidential decree for the rest of the term? Isn't that fascism as well? And of course, without getting into the whole context of it, I mean, why did that political crisis happen in Russia in 1993? I mean, it basically was because the capitalist economic reforms that were implemented, after 1989, or even before then, to a certain extent, were a horrible failure. And again, and the living standards of most people in Russia is probably worse today than it was basically during the Soviet era. But of course that doesn't matter because Yeltsin represents represents capitalism basically, and so they're willing to turn a blind eye to things like that. So to call it an imperfect democratic state in the 1990s is very much understating what actually went on, in 1993, and then afterwards. And then, in many ways, Putin is, of course, the inheritor of that kind of legacy, right? Of the legacy of Yeltsin, who was essentially a kind of fascist leader himself. So again, what does it mean to define something formalistically? So I'm turning here now towards the Marxist.org encyclopedia, and I considered doing this in previous classes, but I didn't. I usually like to stick to the text themselves, but I figure it's worthwhile to maybe talk a little bit more about this term dialectics, since after all, the title of the current book that we're looking on has the term dialectic in the title, and dialectics is, of course, something that we've talked about, numerous times here in this class. And I've tried to already explain this already, so hopefully this won't sound, completely new. But as they define it here, dialectics is the method of reasoning which aims to understand things concretely in all their movement, change, and interconnection with their opposite and contradictory sides in unity. So again, as it relates to something like the idea of dialectic of enlightenment, the Enlightenment is both a movement towards liberation, but also a movement towards control. And so both those contradictory aspects of it are contained within itself. And that sort of knowledge of both the opposing and contradictory sides in unity is something that's more or less unique to the so-called dialectical method. Dialectics is opposed to the formal metaphysical mode of thought of ordinary understanding, which begins with a fixed definition of a thing according to its various attributes. For example, formal thought would explain a fish is something with no legs which lives in the water. Darwin, however, considered fish dialectically. Some of the animals living in the water were not fish, and some of the fish had legs, but it was the genesis of all the animals as part of a whole interconnected process which explained the nature of a fish. They came from something and are evolving into something else. So a dialectical approach to things looks at things as they sort of evolve. It looks at where, as it says, where it came from, and as it's evolving into something else. Whereas formal thinking, which again is very much characteristic of liberalism and very much characteristic of a sort of, the forms of knowledge which support a capitalist system, basically look at things as they are in a very sort of fixed way. So Chaim is saying here in the comment, the United States has almost 1,000 military bases over the world, while Russia has less than 20. The US and Ukraine are the only countries to vote no on the UN vote on denazification of Ukraine because they don't want to give Russia more justification. Actually, I had to go on DuckDuckGo to even find the source that there even was a UN vote. There was no mention of the Azov battalion either, right? The Azov battalion is basically made up of neo-Nazis, like I said. So, yeah, and again, we're going to be seeing images, or have already seen images of Ukrainians, fleeing from, battle scenes, fleeing from, war-torn cities, children being affected by this. All this stuff is true, right? But I mean, Noam Chomsky, for example, talks about, worthy versus unworthy victims, right? So worthy victims are, again, victims that the US media and the military likes to play up as a way to legitimize their military invasions. So the Ukrainian people would be considered worthy victims then. Unworthy victims are the people that undermine, right, these, claims to military action and things like that. So the unworthy victims would be the Palestinian people, would be the people of Yemen who are being, bombed to shit by Saudi Arabia for years now. Unworthy victims would be the people who are the victims of US bombings and drone strikes and things like that, people in Afghanistan and Iraq. So it's not to say that the images that we see of people in Ukraine aren't horrible, and I'm not saying that they're not real or something like that, but there's this very sort of one-sided hypocritical way in which we are only given, imagery, like literally of those people, of those victims, basically, while other people who are basically, victimized in almost the same way by the US or by US supported allies that we never see about, that we never see, or unless you go to, obscure websites, I guess, and really, have to dig around for it. You can find it, of course, but yeah, you kind of have to, like search for it. And so, yeah, I've been reading stuff about that. The Ukraine's basically filled, the Ukrainian government at least has basically filled a lot of Nazis and things like that. Obviously, that doesn't justify what happens to the people there. Obviously, people are really being, impacted by this and being harmed by this, and it is a horrible thing. But I just, I think there's an important need to sort of, go against these extremely simplistic narratives that we get, these very simplistic interpretations that we get from, the mainstream media, and I would say from a significant part of, the American academic world as well, which, like I said, I mean, people don't talk about academics as much, probably because they don't read them, but I would say that most of what you could say about the US media in this country basically also applies to, US academics as well, historians, political scientists, economists, so on and so forth. Okay. So good point. Yeah, good point to bring that up. So let me go back to this idea of formalism. So as it says here, dialectics is opposed to a formal understanding of things. And I'm not going to read out everything here. You know, you can look at this yourself. It is a fairly long definition. I mean, not significantly long. Formal thinking often has trouble understanding the causes of events. Something has to be a cause and something else the effect. And people are surprised when they irrigate land and 20 years later, due to salination of the land, silting of the waterways, etc., they have a desert. Dialectics, on the other hand, understands the cause and effect of just one and another side of a whole network of relations, such as we have in an ecosystem, and one thing cannot be changed without changing the whole system. It talks a little bit about the history of dialectics in ancient societies, ancient Chinese thought, ancient Greek thinkers, the importance of Hegel really in emphasizing a dialectical method, and sort of how it was, you know, taken over by Marx and Engels. So there's a lot of stuff here to read. I'm not going to go over all of it. It also gives you links to various writings and things like that. This is a, you know, a good resource if you want to learn more about this. But let me turn to this notion of formalism. Now, all right. So already, even in the first chapter of Dialectic of Enlightenment, you might have noticed Adorno makes several references to formal logic and things like that. In fact, let me briefly go over to the PowerPoint and then switch back to here for a second. So this is what I would have talked about last class. Of course, I didn't get a chance to. But Adorno makes frequent references to formal logic. This is essentially what he's talking about. P equals P, P equals not P, you know, all this other stuff. It looks very mathematical, looks very, you know, it's even referred to here as a propositional calculus. I haven't talked as much about formalism up until now. I have mentioned several times, though, this theme of quantity over quality, right? Which is a tendency, of course, which the Frankfurt School is opposed to. Formalism, I would say, very much goes hand in hand with a very sort of, you know, quantitative outlook on things, or a very sort of, you know, quantitative methods. And again, very much defines a large part of the American academic world. They deal in quantitative methods and formalistic concepts. So as this explains here, formal logic, symbolic logic, only concerned with the correctness rather than the truth of a logical process, concerns itself with the form rather than the substance of the argument. Material logic, critical thinking, i.e. critical theory, concerned with the truth, the substance of the argument, establishes connection between thought contents and reality to arrive at the conclusion. So the dialectical method, which of course is very much a part of the Marxist method or the Marxist theory, relies on material logic more so than it does on formal logic. And I think, in no uncertain terms, I think it's a vastly superior way of looking at the world. I mean, that's why if I make lots of references to Marxist thinkers and Marxism and stuff like that, and it sounds almost like a cult, you know, a cultish thing or something like that, it's not. It's just that they, I think, have a better way of looking at the world, rather than liberalism, rather than sort of, you know, the mainstream establishment, which very much relies on formal logic. So it's not just a question that, you know, Marxist or a socialist versus a liberal takes, you know, opposing views on you know, the right to healthcare and on war and on things like that. It's not just that socialists, I think, have better takes on these issues. Even more important is how they get to arrive at these positions. You know, what they base their theories on, which I think is superior in the case of socialism. And I think actually gives you the confidence to think that those opinions are the correct ones, because it's how they arrive at those opinions, which I think are better. So mainstream Western thought, whatever you want to call it, liberalism, very much relies on these formal definitions of things, including in political science. And this is where I'm really going here with this, and that the concept of democracy in political science rests on formalism. So let me try to explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So as it's defined here, overemphasis on form as against the content or meaning of something, especially in politics or in the theory of art, mathematics, and ethics. Oh wait, let me go back one second to dialectics. Where was that, however? Or is it under a different? Oh, it's okay. It's under the next thing I'm going to look at. All right, so that leads to this idea of content and form. So again, a dialectical relationship exists between content and form. So it's not to criticize formalism doesn't mean that you're against form, because everything to exist has to have a certain form. Everything has to have a certain sort of shape and structure to it. I mean, it's almost impossible to even imagine content without form. But content basically refers to what's concrete, what's real, the material reality of things, whereas form, again, relates to sort of the overarching shape or structure of things. And it's important, again, to understand this in a dialectical relationship, how these concepts relate to each other. The problem with formalism, then, is that it overemphasizes form over content. So what you're left with many times is a form without content, or if I were to use it as a metaphor, basically like an empty shell or an empty container, something that's essentially hollow on the inside. So I would argue that democracy, the concept of democracy in American political science, again, I've always been told that these tendencies are even more predominant in the United States than they are in other countries, which I suppose is true. I mean, defines democracy in terms of form, in terms of political parties, elections. Essentially, that's it. But it's form without content. It's just the existence of those things, regardless of whether or not, the content of democracy actually speaks to that. So what would be the content of democracy? I mean, there are many ways in which you can define it, but why not go with Abe Lincoln's phrase, right? Government of the people, for the people, by the people. If that's the content of democracy, then we're very far from that, right? Our government is completely, or almost completely, unresponsive to anything that the majority of people want in this country, including healthcare, including various other things like that. So what we have is the form without the content. We have political parties, neither of which represents the American public. We have political parties that imply that there's supposed to be a choice between, different policies and, strategies of rule. But the reality, of course, is when you look closer at when you look at the content of those political parties, they're almost the same. You'd be hard pressed to really find a significant difference between the two, especially on the most important issues, right? I mean, it's all but impossible to really vote against the interests of Wall Street in American politics. It's virtually impossible to vote against the interests of the military as well. Both parties basically serve those interests, and again, both parties are very much out of step with what the majority of people want here in this country. The other sort of formal aspect of democracy are elections, which, yeah, great. Elections are important. In our country, barely half of the electorate even shows up to vote, not to mention the fact that we've had all sorts of, voter suppression laws, not to mention the fact that, even by this formal definition of democracy, that the United States couldn't even really meet that criteria until about 1965, when the Voting Rights Act is passed, right? Because then you were excluding a significant portion of the population from even being allowed to vote. And of course, over the last decade or so, there've been all sorts of attempts at suppressing the vote once again, since the Supreme Court has basically gutted the Voting Rights Act. But again, I mean, half the barely half the people even show up to vote in elections, probably mostly because they realize that choosing between Coke and Pepsi, which are basically what the Republicans and Democrats represent, is hardly a meaningful choice at all. So we have the form of democracy, we have the formal aspects of it, but we don't have the content. And I would say that you could argue much the same thing about Ukraine. I mean, to go back to this article for a second, if you look at this paragraph here, the second paragraph, how many times do they mention democracy? 3 or 4 times. I mean, if we were playing a drinking game where we take a shot every time we hear the word democracy, we'd all be drunk by the end of this paragraph. And what does it mean? I mean, it means nothing more than the formal aspects of it. That you have the form of democracy without any of the content. unless you think a government filled with neo-Nazis has the content of democracy, or our government, for example, which is very much beholden to the interests of Wall Street and the military-industrial complex and big corporations. So this idea of content and form is very important, and very much I think demonstrates the superiority of a dialectical method, which is very much what the Frankfurt School is offering, and what Marxist theorists in general are offering, rather than a formalistic concept of things, which is pretty much what you're going to get most of the time. American society basically runs on formalism. It basically, it forms the underpinning to almost every type of knowledge that we have here in this country, especially in political science, which, I'll limit most of my comments about formalism to that. But I think it is a very much important thing to consider, how we define democracy in a very sort of, formalistic way. Form and content are a unity of opposites. They are two aspects of one and the same thing, which in the process of development of the thing and its cognition interpenetrate one another, interact and transform one into the other. Form becomes content and content form. Again, this is a dialectical approach to things. There can be no content without a form. A thing exists in one form or another, nor form without content. Everything is connected to other things, is capable of transforming into something else, leads to something else. But a given form may be more or less true to the content. Now they referenced democracy somewhere. Where is it? Why am I not seeing that now? But again, I think understanding the sort of dialectical relationship between form and content is important. It's why Adorno and Horkheimer make references to formal logic, in a negative way, in a critical way. And I think it very much relates to what we're talking about now. It's only because you define democracy in a formalistic way that you can call a government like Ukraine democratic, or the United States for that matter, or frankly, any capitalist democracy that exists in the world today. That these are all basically concepts which are defined in terms of formalism. And again, formalism, along with a quantitative, outlook, very much, makes up a large part of the ideology of American society. It's more than just a scholarly, debate or a difference in schools of thought and things like that. Formalism and a quantitative outlook take on a much more kind of, sinister form and become much more significant when you consider the extent to which they actually sort of make up the dominant ideology of American life, basically, of American society and of capitalism. Where is the reference, though, to democracy? This is actually what kind of put me over the edge about showing this, where they actually make a reference to. Oh, here it is. How did I miss this? Darwin went behind the appearance of a fish to get to their essence. For ordinary understanding, there's no difference between the appearance of a thing and its essence. But for dialectics, the form and content of something can be quite contradictory. Parliamentary democracy being the prime example. Democracy in form, but dictatorship in content. It's exactly the point I'm trying to make. Parliamentary democracy is basically more the European form of democracy, but it would basically apply here to the United States as well. So again, that's why I think these are very, it's important to understand the dialectical approach. It literally, like I said, is in the title of the book that we've been looking at for the last week or so. It very much forms a major foundation of the sort of the Marxist, approach to theory and really what critical theory is. So I hope that people at least come away with this with an understanding of the term dialectics, again, as a mode of reasoning, understand things concretely, and there should be certain things that really stand out about that, right? Change, interconnection, how things evolve, how they change over time, all of which I think again are important, and all of which I think demonstrates a superior form of knowledge, basically, or a superior way of understanding things, understanding the world, basically, than the kind of formalistic version, which is basically what we mostly get. All right, is that more or less clear then? I hope so. So let me, that's pretty much all I have to say about Russia and the Ukraine. I mean, if anyone has any other comments, I mean, speak, or I'll just, or write or type, or I'll just basically switch over to the PowerPoint as soon as I take a sip of water. Okay. So I didn't include, this as a, as part of the readings, but I think it is worthwhile, reading yourself. It's very easy to access. You go to Marxist.org, go to the encyclopedia, and basically you can find most of the stuff there. All right. So we already talked about this. So before getting into the culture industry, I just want to read out one last thing from the first essay, which deals with Odysseus and the sirens. This actually falls into the first essay, but the second essay very much deals with, sort of elaborates on this theme more, which I'm mostly going to skip over. So let me get to that. Now, I don't know if everyone's, familiar with this story from mythology. It's basically from Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus is, the main character. It's where the word Odyssey comes from, also known as Ulysses. Ulysses also being the title of James Joyce's most well-known novel as well, who I've mentioned a couple of times here. But again, their sort of usage of this story of Odysseus encountering the sirens, who are these sort of demigods or demonic creatures who sing the song, which is captivating and sort of entrances people. It's a very well-known story within Greek mythology, but their sort of take on it and their sort of understanding of it as a metaphor, I think, is very interesting. So let me just read some of this. So the urge to rescue the past as something living. Oh, by the way, rescuing the past, also very much a theme that you would find in Benjamin as well. The urge to rescue the past as something living, instead of using it as the material of progress, has been satisfied only in art, in which even history as a representation of past life is included. As long as art does not insist on being treated as knowledge and thus exclude itself from praxis, it is tolerated by social praxis in the same way as pleasure. But the siren song has not yet been deprived of power as art. So what they're saying is that the siren song is basically a metaphor for art. It's a metaphor for basically culture, fulfillment, all which is basically denied to most people. They have knowledge, they being the sirens, have knowledge of all that has ever happened on this fruitful earth, and especially of what has befallen Odysseus himself. For we know all that the Argives and the Trojans suffered on the broad plain of Troy by the will of the gods. But directly invoking the recent past, and with the irresistible promise of pleasure which their song contains, the sirens threaten the patriarchal order, which gives each person back their life only in exchange for their full measure of time. And this, of course, is an artistic depiction of the sirens, these sort of like, bird-like creatures with the, the heads of women, basically. You see Odysseus sort of tied up to the mast. They'll reference that in the next passage. And the workers here who have their ears plugged up with wax, so they can't hear the siren's song. So the siren's song, again, is irresistible. If you hear it, then you'll just forget about whatever else that you're doing and basically just become completely entranced by the sirens. So Odysseus has the workers sort of plug up their ears so they can't hear the siren's call. Interestingly, and Adorno and Horkheimer place a lot of emphasis on this, Odysseus himself doesn't do that, though, right? He hears what they have to say, or he hears their song, but he has himself sort of tied to the mast rather than plugging his ears. So what do they mean by that? No one who hears their song can escape. Humanity had to inflict terrible injuries on itself before the self, the identical, purpose-directed, masculine character of human beings was created, and something of this process is repeated in every childhood. Masculine meaning, what is he saying here? Is that, real men, basically, real macho men, they have no time for art and for pleasure and fulfillment and things like that. They got to go out and, conquer the world. That image of masculinity, which has been around for centuries, of course, but very much you would see it a lot, of course, in this sort of, post-war 1950s American culture, the very, stoic American male who's, very practical and, pragmatic and things like that. Anyway, the effort to hold itself together attends the ego at all its stages, and the temptation to be rid of the ego has always gone hand in hand with the blind determination to preserve it. So he knows only two possibilities of escape, he being Odysseus. One, he prescribes to his comrades. He plugs their ears with wax and orders them to row with all their might. Anyone who wishes to survive must not listen to the temptation of the irrecoverable and is unable to listen only if he's unable to hear. Society has always made sure that this was the case. Workers must look ahead with alert concentration and ignore anything which lies to one side. The urge toward distraction must be grimly sublimated in redoubled exertions. Thus, the workers are made practical. So what he's saying is that, or what Adorno and Horkheimer are saying, is that the workers are denied the benefits of culture. They're denied arts. They're not exposed to it. They don't hear this siren song, which again is what metaphorically represents art and culture, civilization. They are denied, sort of the bounties and benefits of culture and art, basically, and they just have to work. And of course, because they're working all the time, they don't really have the time for these things anyway. But they're more or less denied those benefits, which you could say is a condescending view, and I think that is fair, as I've already mentioned, before. I think the Frankfurt School have a lot of interesting insights into things, but this also represents a moment or a tendency where Marxism very much turns against the working class, and it becomes very much a sort of elite, academic, intellectual area, basically, that has very little, time for the workers, basically. So that kind of condescension towards the workers is already being evidenced here. Adorno's. I say Adorno because I think he's responsible for most of the stuff that we're reading here, though obviously it's co-authored. Horkheimer kind of shares his view as well. But this idea that like the workers, they don't get art, they don't get culture and things like that. It is a very condescending view, but of course that there might be some truth to it as well, even if they do maybe over exaggerate it. But what does Odysseus do? Why is he tied to the mast instead of plugging up his ears? So the other possibility Odysseus chooses for himself, the landowner who has others to work for him. He listens, but does so while bound helplessly to the mast. And the stronger the allurement grows, the more tightly he has himself bound. Just as later the bourgeois denied themselves happiness, the closer it drew to them with the increase in their own power. What he hears has no consequences for him. He can signal to his men to untie him only by movements of his head, but it is too late. His comrades, who themselves cannot hear, know only of the danger of the song, not of its beauty, and leave him tied to the mast to save both him and themselves. They reproduce the life of the oppressor as a part of their own, while he cannot step outside his social role. So what he's saying is that the bourgeois, Odysseus, who basically represents the bourgeois, he's the landowner. He owns property, basically. He's the property owner. He's allowed to hear this. He's allowed to, again, enjoy the benefits of art and culture and things like that. But he sort of imposes this own kind of impotence upon himself, which is sort of, symbolically what being, literally bound to this the mast suggests, and maybe even the fact that it's kind of like a phallic symbol might be significant as well. I'm not sure, but this idea of being bound and tied up obviously is a symbolization of impotence, basically. So he's saying that the workers are just denied this altogether. They have no knowledge of the kind of art and culture and the kind of fulfillment or the sense of fulfillment that comes from that. Odysseus, as a property owner, is allowed to hear this, is allowed to sort of hear the siren song of art and culture, to be aware of the fulfillment that life can be, but denies himself that. Just as in the sense of what you'd see among the bourgeois, this kind of self-denial of things. They just got to work constantly, don't enjoy life. You can be aware of it, through education and things like that, but you can't take it too seriously. It is, after all, just art. You can't take art too seriously. You can't take the sense of fulfillment. And of course, Adorno and Horkheimer do take art seriously. They do take what they recall the promise of fulfillment in art seriously, that art is a major beacon of a kind of better life that is possible. But a life in which, again, even though the bourgeois allow themselves this in a passive way, they can't allow themselves to actually, make good on this promise. And so voluntarily suppress themselves, basically. I mean, that's essentially what they're saying here. And I think that this is a very sort of telling insight. I mean, maybe it even speaks a lot about, Adorno and Horkheimer themselves, who come out of a bourgeois background. But many people, again, especially among the sort of, upper strata of, educated elites and things like that, intellectual elites, cultured elites, people that read the New Yorker magazine, things like that. We'll be reading a New Yorker article later on in the class. So it's not a coincidence that I chose that publication. But they'll read stuff like this, and they'll nod their heads in assent, and they'll agree more or less with what Adorno and Horkheimer are saying, but then they don't do anything about it. They just sort of accept things the way they are. It reveals them their own sense of impotence, that yes, we agree with everything that you're saying. It's just that we can't change things. This is just the way things are. And even going back to their, skepticism over, the quantitative over quality, quantity over quality, the same people who read these things and sort of nod their heads yes are the same people who do things like that. They'll agree with the fact, yeah, we shouldn't, reduce people to numbers. We shouldn't reduce people to their credit scores or their grade score or their GPA or their test scores and things like that. They agree with that, but then they go about in practice and evaluate people by those very same things. You would have thought in the decades since this has been written, the people would have figured out a better way to judge things, to evaluate things. But we still rely upon all the same sort of, quantitative methods, which everyone agrees has flaws, which everyone agrees, again, does reduce people to numbers, that does, sort of abstract from reality, which gives you, again, a formalistic view of reality rather than a concrete view of reality. And they all agree with this, but they don't do anything about it. So I think there's a lot of importance in this metaphor, and I think it's very significant in that regard. Again, impotence. The bonds by which he has irrevocably fettered himself to praxis at the same time keeps the sirens at a distance from praxis. Praxis being action, basically theoretically guided action, essentially. Their lure is neutralized as a mere object of contemplation as art. So again, art exists. We understand that we enjoy it, but we don't take it too seriously. It's just art. It's not meant to. We're not supposed to like recreate society in accordance to the sense of fulfillment that we gain from art, even though that's exactly what Adorno and Horkheimer basically have in mind. And again, they do kind of take this idea seriously. This next line I think is a particularly brilliant phrase. The fettered man, the bound man, listens to a concert as immobilized as audiences later, and his enthusiastic call for liberation goes unheard as applause. So again, this sort of promise of a better life that art provides, and music is significant as well. And that Adorno is very versed in music. It sort of hits you in the moment, right? It sort of inspires you. It speaks to you in the moment, but it goes away. It's just a temporary sort of transient thing, which goes away as soon as people are done, applauding at the end of the concert. In this way, the enjoyment of art and manual work diverge as the primeval world is left behind. The epic already contains the correct theory. Between the cultural heritage and enforced work, there is a precise correlation, and both are founded on the inescapable compulsion toward the social control of nature. Which again, I think is the dominant theme of this book. So as I was reading some of the discussion papers, I realized that this is a dense reading, but I mean, I think some people have gone maybe a little off track a little bit in that, it's not really a book about gods or anything like that, or religion or anything like that. They talk about that, obviously, and it does factor into things, but I don't think it's about that. It's really, if there's a single dominant theme in this book, it's basically about humanity's compulsion towards control of nature, towards control of other people, which they find in ancient religions as well, right? Many ancient religions have that almost like kind of exchange-like mechanism to it, which is like, you know, you perform the ritual, you do the sacrifice, you pay your tribute, whatever it is, and in exchange for that, you get a good crop harvest, or, you know, whatever it is that people are looking for. So there is kind of like an exchange mechanism that you even see in ancient religions as well, which is like, you know, you do this, and in exchange you get this, and it usually is, of course, is something to your own benefit. What they see then is this gradual sort of evolution into modern day, you know, science, the modern day sort of scientific world, which has just sort of refined the means of control even more. Now you don't pray towards the god for a good harvest. You find new means of irrigation and genetically modified seeds and pesticides and things like that. Science has sort of taken the place of religion, but again, the compulsion towards, you know, control is still the same. I think that's really sort of what the overarching theme here is of this book. And so this passage I did talk about a little bit last class. Sorry, my computer's about to die. Whereas, you know, again, they don't really see any alternative. You know, it'd be one thing if you could, if this was all, you know, defining of capitalism, and you could simply just, well, we're going to go towards socialism then, and that'll be the alternative towards this, you know, compulsion towards controlling things. But they see socialism, at least as it exists in, you know, the Soviet Union and other countries like that. In fact, there weren't really any others besides the Soviet Union at that time. Not 1944. You know, the People's Republic of China isn't, you know, founded until 1949. Cuba comes later. You know, so you know, communism and other, you know, so-called communism in other countries that doesn't happen until later. At this point, all you really have is the Soviet Union. And they also see the same sort of compulsion towards control, obviously represented by the Soviet Union, as in the capitalist democracies of the West. So there is no real way out of this, at least as far as they see it. And they increasingly do sort of, you know, retreat into things like art. And actually, for Horkheimer later on does kind of retreat into religion, in all honesty, although his own sort of, you know, idiosyncratic take on it. But they increasingly sort of turn away. They increasingly find less and less real practical alternatives towards this compulsion towards control, which they see basically as defining aspects of all of civilization, basically. Excuse me. And in that regard, even capitalism becomes just sort of another moment, another stage in this progressive process of domination and control. It marks a particularly, you know, sort of advanced level of control and domination, but it itself is sort of a symptomatic of something even bigger in a sense. At least that's what they're saying. So now we turn towards the culture industry. And of course, we're almost out of time, but I can at least make a few introductory comments and hopefully go into more next class. So this comes from later on in the book, right? Everything that we've looked at so far is basically, you know, within the first 35 pages. Then we kind of jump ahead to about page 95. This is the longest essay in the book. Again, the idea of the culture industry is I think it's safe to say where you know, the legacy of the Frankfurt School really comes from, what they're most sort of known for, their most sort of enduring concept. How does it relate to the rest of the book? How does it relate to the rest of the argument of this book? I think what they're arguing here, and of course they do take a very sort of elitist, and again, you could say sort of condescending approach towards mass culture, towards what we would call, you know, popular culture, things that are consumed by the masses, basically, things that are popular among the masses of people. They do take a very sort of, you know, condescending view towards that. But I think it's more than just intellectual elitism on their part, although I think that does play a role. It relates to their overall argument in that the culture industry represents, again, a very sophisticated form of controlling people, which is very much, in many ways, kind of almost the mirror image of fascism. And of course, there are numerous references, particularly later on in the essay, towards fascism as well. I think in no uncertain terms, and here I do think Adorno definitely takes most of the lead here in sort of articulating this theory, although I'm sure Horkheimer plays somewhat of a role as well. But for Adorno and Horkheimer, the culture industry represents an even more sort of sophisticated means of controlling people, rather than the sort of more naked brutality and violence that fascism represents. Here, it creates the illusion, again, of democracy. Again, a formalistic idea of democracy. And Adorno, and I know I pulled the quote here, though it's later on, does even refer to what he calls as formal freedom. A formalistic idea of freedom rather than concrete freedom, rather than the real thing, basically. Just a hollow shell of freedom, essentially. That the culture industry represents a sort of more sophisticated means of controlling people, which is in that regard even more advanced than fascism, because it doesn't rely on such sort of direct forms of brutality, but gives this sort of facade of democracy that sort of flatters people to a certain extent, to think that their needs are actually being taken care of, even though in the most crucial ways, their needs are not being fulfilled at all. So that's how I think it more or less, fits into the overall structure of the book here, and how it, relates to the overall argument that they're trying to make. Let me just start reading. I'll try to get through as much as I can. We only have about 5 minutes left, but so they say very early on, the conspicuous unity of macrocosm and microcosm confronts human beings with a model of their culture, the false identity of universal and particular. So universal and particular, again, refer to the sort of dialectical relationship between things. The universal being sort of the all-encompassing thing, and the particular being, specific things. And when he says the false identity of the two, what he's meaning is that people, again, are given this illusion that their needs are being fulfilled, but it's fulfilled only to the extent in which you basically conform to sort of a predetermined notion of what the dominant culture affords you. Conformity is a very big theme in this essay as well. The idea of a kind of a herd mentality. People who don't really think for themselves, but basically just adapt to or conform to basically the prevailing standards and culture of the society that we live in. And I think that's very much an important insight, which still very much plays a role today. And they even refer in certain points to people that are become so anxious about like missing out on like the latest trend or the latest fashion or something like that they have to be like a part of those things no matter what. What is that kind of existential fear and angst that people feel that when they're not a part of like the latest trend or something like that sense of anxiety that seems to be a part of so many people. It speaks to that fear of being outside the herd, or being outside of the being outside of the group. For some people, that need is very strong. For some people, not as much. But I mean, it's I think fairly obvious to see that for a lot of people, that is a very strong need that people have, that they want to feel that they're a part of things. Anyway, all mass culture under monopoly is identical. And the contours of its skeleton, the conceptual armature fabricated by monopoly, are beginning to stand out. Those in charge no longer take much trouble to conceal the structure, the power of which increases the more bluntly its existence is admitted. Film and radio no longer need to present themselves as art. The truth that they are nothing but business is used as an ideology to legitimize the trash they intentionally produce. So that pretty much tells you what Adorno and Horkheimer basically think of most of mass culture. It's trash, basically. And of course, I think they're also right to point out that most people who create mass culture do so, they're aware that they're creating a product, right? They have no artistic pretensions, at least for the most part. Maybe some of the people that work on these things do, but the owners, the ones that control the studios and things like that, they're very much aware of the fact that they're producing a product, that they're producing a commodity. And as I've said, in many ways, again, if you want to summarize what this is about, is taking the Marxist idea of the commodity and basically applying it to culture or applying it to art. What happens to art when it becomes a commodity produced in the marketplace? And this is, essentially their explanation for that. And again, I think that's true, and I think that's still very much true today. That most people that create mass culture, don't really have any artistic pretensions for what they're doing. That they're very much aware that it is a business, basically. That they're churning out product, basically. Even though I think that some of the people who work on these things, the so-called creative, personnel that themselves may in fact have those artistic illusions, but I think that may be a bit of a delusion on their part. No, I'm like having problems with my PowerPoint now. At the very end of class. It looks like I am. Let's see. I'll probably just end things now then. I mean, we only have like 3 minutes left. Well, let me read out this last quote and then I'll break. So automobiles, bombs, and films hold the totality together, hold the society together until their leveling element demonstrates its power against the very system of injustice it served. For the present, the technology of the culture industry confines itself to standardization and mass production and sacrifices what once distinguished the logic of the work from that of society. These adverse effects, however, should not be attributed to the internal laws of technology itself, but to its function within the economy today. Any need which might escape the central control is repressed by that of individual consciousness. And again, that's very much what defines the culture industry as an industry. It's this idea that culture is essentially produced as if it's coming off an assembly line. Maybe not literally. That's not literally physically coming off an assembly line, but it might as well be. That it is standardized, that everything is essentially the same. Any superficial difference between any of the products that come out, whether in terms, and they're basically talking about movies and radio. Of course, we can then expand this to television, video games, as I mentioned last class, various other things, all have that kind of standardization. There are superficial differences between these things, but basically it's more or less the same thing. And again, it's not intended to be a legitimate work of art, but simply a product that is satisfying a need for consumption, basically. And I like this idea that automobiles, bombs, and films, until their leveling element demonstrates its power against the very system of justice it's served. What they're saying, basically, and again, one of the most negative effects of the culture industry is, again, in no uncertain terms, it's dumbing down effect. I mean, it's literally dumbing people down to the sense that they can't think anymore, and then it dumbs people down so much that a lot of them get sort of sucked up by fascist movements and things like that, and then they in turn even turn against the capitalist system which sort of created them in the first place. And I think that's an interesting thing to consider in the aftermath of January 6th and Trump and things like that, that we've so degraded people and dumbed down people so much that now they're willing to be absorbed by any kind of authoritarian movement which speaks to them or appeals to them in some way. All right, anyway, it's 1:30, so I'll stop here. Does anyone have anything to say? Any comments or anything? Otherwise, we'll just pick this up next class. All right, so take care, everyone. I'll see you Thursday.